baby found a bear cub hidden in a shoe store display. What he did next stepped up for justice. The afternoon sun filtered through the old glass windows of Morrison's Shoe Emporium, casting long golden streaks across rows and rows of polished leather. The store had been there for 43 years, tucked between a bakery and a small bookshop on Maple Street. The smell of leather mixed with furniture polish created that particular scent that only old shoe stores seemed to have. Ethan Marshall pushed the glass door open, holding it wide for his wife Lily Morgan, who carried their 18-month-old son Jacob in her arms. The little bell above the door chimed softly, a sound that had welcomed thousands of customers over the decades. Jacob's eyes went wide at the tinkling sound, his small hands reaching up toward the brass bell as if he could catch the notes floating in the air. The store was quiet that Tuesday afternoon, with only the soft tick of an antique clock on the wall and the gentle hum of the ceiling fan breaking the silence. Mr. Morrison, the elderly owner, nodded from behind the counter where he was polishing a pair of Oxford shoes with careful, practiced movements. His hands moved in small circles, the same way they had for decades, finding peace in the repetitive motion. Ethan needed new work boots, the kind that would last through another year of construction sites and long days. Lily had suggested this place, remembering how her father used to bring her here when she was young, back when buying shoes was an event, not just a quick transaction. Jacob squirmed in Lily's arms, wanting to explore this new world of colors and textures. She set him down carefully, keeping one hand on his shoulder as his little legs found their balance. At 18 months, he was still wobbly but determined, each step a small victory. His tiny sneakers made soft padding sounds on the worn wooden floor as he toddled forward, drawn to the lower shelves where children's shoes were displayed in neat rows. The afternoon light caught the buckles and laces, making them shine like tiny treasures. Jacob reached out with chubby fingers, touching the smooth leather of a small boot, then a canvas sneaker, his face serious with concentration as he explored each new texture. Ethan was examining a pair of steel-toed boots when he heard Jacob make a sound he'd never heard before. It wasn't his usual babble or laugh, but something softer, almost like a coo. He turned to see his son crouched in front of the bottom shelf, peering intently into a display boot that sat slightly apart from the others. The boot was an old hiking boot, the kind with red laces and worn leather that told stories of mountain trails and forest paths. Jacob's whole body was still, an unusual state for a toddler who normally couldn't stop moving. His small hand reached slowly into the boot, and that's when Ethan saw Jacob's eyes grow impossibly wide, his mouth forming a perfect O of surprise. Lily noticed too, moving closer to see what had captured their son's complete attention. Jacob pulled his hand back gently, and clutched in his tiny fingers was something that made both parents freeze. It was fur, soft brown fur attached to something warm and breathing. Jacob held it so carefully, as if he understood instinctively that this was something precious, something that needed gentle hands. The thing in his hands moved slightly and a tiny pink nose emerged from the fur, followed by the smallest black eyes either parent had ever seen. It was a bear cub, impossibly small, no bigger than Jacob's two hands put together. The cub couldn't have been more than a few days old, its eyes barely open, its breathing shallow but steady. How it had gotten into the boot was a mystery that seemed to hang in the air like dust motes in the afternoon sun. Jacob sat down with a soft thump, cradling the tiny creature against his chest with a tenderness that seemed beyond his years. The cub made a sound, barely audible, like a sigh, and nestled closer to the warmth of the child's body. Ethan and Lily exchanged glances, a whole conversation passing between them without words. This wasn't possible, yet here it was, happening in the most ordinary of places, on the most ordinary of afternoons. Mr. Morrison had looked up from his polishing, his weathered hands stilling on the leather. He walked over slowly, his footsteps deliberate and careful, as if sudden movements might shatter whatever magic was happening. When he saw what Jacob held, his face didn't show surprise exactly, but something else, something that looked almost like recognition. He lowered himself onto a nearby stool with the careful movements of age, his eyes never leaving the tiny bear cub. The store seemed to hold its breath. Even the clock's ticking seemed softer, as if time itself was being careful not to disturb this moment. "Been waiting for this," Mr. Morrison said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, mysterious and weighted with meaning. Ethan started to ask what he meant, but the old man held up a hand, his eyes still on Jacob and the cub. The baby was humming now, a tuneless little melody that seemed to calm the tiny creature even more. The cub's breathing had steadied, matching Jacob's rhythm as if they were synchronized by some invisible thread. It was beautiful and strange and somehow perfect. This connection between a human child and a wild creature that should have been with its mother somewhere in the forest, not in a shoe store on Maple Street. Lily knelt beside her son, her photographer's eye taking in every detail of this impossible scene. The way the afternoon light created a halo around Jacob's messy hair, the gentle curve of his small hands protecting the cub, the absolute trust in both tiny beings. She didn't reach for her camera, though her fingers itched to capture this moment. Some things, she understood, were meant to be held only in memory, too precious for anything else. The cub's eyes opened fully for the first time, looking directly at Jacob, and the baby laughed, a pure sound of joy that seemed to fill the entire store. "There's something you need to see," Mr. Morrison said, standing with effort and walking to the back of the store. His movements were purposeful now, as if a decision had been made. He disappeared behind a curtain that separated the shop floor from the storage area, and they could hear him moving boxes, searching for something. Ethan wanted to ask a dozen questions, but something about the moment kept him silent. Jacob continued to hold the cub, swaying slightly as if rocking it to sleep, his young face serene with a purpose he couldn't possibly understand but seemed to feel in his bones. When Mr. Morrison returned, he carried a small wooden box, the kind that might hold jewelry or important documents. The wood was old, polished smooth by years of handling, with small symbols carved into the lid that looked like they might be Native American in origin. He set it on the counter and opened it carefully, revealing a collection of items that seemed to make no sense together. A faded photograph, a small leather pouch, a brass compass, and what looked like a very old map drawn on animal hide. But it was the photograph that drew their attention. It showed a much younger Mr. Morrison standing next to a woman in forest ranger uniform, and between them, a bear, fully grown but calm, almost dignified in its posture. "That was 43 years ago," Mr. Morrison began, his voice taking on the quality of someone reaching back through time. "The day I opened this store, the same day I made a promise." He touched the photograph gently, his fingers trembling slightly. Her name was Sarah, the ranger. She brought me an injured cub that day, asked me to keep it safe while she went for help. The mother had been killed by poachers, and the cub was dying. His eyes grew distant, seeing something beyond the walls of the store. I didn't know anything about bears, but I knew about keeping promises. I fed that cub with a bottle every 2 hours for 3 weeks, right here in the back room. The store seemed to listen to his story, the walls themselves holding the memory. Jacob had grown quiet, still holding the cub, but watching Mr. Morrison with the intense focus that children sometimes have when they sense something important is happening. The cub had fallen asleep, its tiny chest rising and falling against Jacob's shirt, creating a small warm spot that the child seemed to protect with his whole being. Lily reached over and gently stroked Jacob's hair, feeling the weight of the moment. The sense that they had stumbled into something much larger than a simple shopping trip. The cub survived, Mr. Morrison continued, grew strong and healthy. Sarah came every day to check on him, and somewhere in those weeks, we fell in love. She taught me about the forest, about the delicate balance between human and wild spaces. When it was time to release the bear back to the wild, she asked me to keep something. He pulled out the leather pouch from the box, opening it to reveal a single bear claw, polished and mounted on a leather cord. She said it was for protection, but not the kind most people think. Protection of a promise, a covenant between species. She said one day, the forest would need our help again, and we would know when. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine, not from fear, but from the sense of standing at the edge of something profound. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting the store in a golden glow that made everything look slightly otherworldly. The rows of shoes, the ordinary fixtures of commerce, seemed to fade into the background, leaving only this small circle of humans and one tiny bear, connected by threads invisible but undeniable. Mr. Morrison reached under the counter and pulled out another item, a newer photograph that he'd apparently kept separate from the box. Sarah passed 5 years ago, he said softly, and for the first time, his voice cracked slightly, but before she went, she told me the story would continue. She said to watch for a child who would know without being taught, who would find what was hidden without searching. His eyes moved to Jacob, who was now looking directly at him with those serious toddler eyes that seemed far too knowing. She said the child would be the bridge. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning that none of them fully grasped, but all of them felt. The cub stirred in Jacob's arms, making a small sound that might have been contentment. Jacob responded by adjusting his hold, supporting the tiny creature's head the way Lily had taught him to be gentle with his baby cousin. The natural ease of it, the instinctive care, made Lily's eyes fill with tears she didn't fully understand. This wasn't just about a found animal. This was about something deeper, something that connected them all to rhythms and responsibilities older than the town itself. She thought about all the times Jacob had been drawn to animals, how dogs would cross streets to greet him, how birds seemed to sing louder when he was in the garden. But how did it get here? Ethan finally asked, his practical mind needing at least some logic to hold on to. Mr. Morrison walked to the display where Jacob had found the cub, kneeling, despite his protesting knees, to examine the boot. Behind it, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was a small opening in the wall, no bigger than a softball. Through it, they could see daylight and hear, very faintly, the sound of wind in trees. The back of the store, they realized, pressed against the edge of the forest preserve that bordered the town, a detail they'd never noticed or thought significant until now. The mother must have known, Mr. Morrison said quietly. Animals know things we've forgotten how to know. She brought her cub to the safest place she could find before... He didn't finish the sentence, but they all understood. Somewhere out there, a mother bear had made an impossible choice, trusting her baby to the strange intersection between wild and civilized, hoping against hope that kindness still existed in the human world. The weight of that trust settled on all of them, but most of all on Jacob, who seemed to accept it with the simple grace that only children possess. Mr. Morrison stood and walked to the phone on the counter, but before dialing, he turned back to them. "I know someone who can help, someone Sarah trained before she retired, but first, we need to understand what we're dealing with here." He gestured to the cub, which had woken and was now looking around with slightly more alert eyes. This little one is maybe 3 days old, 4 at most. Without its mother, it won't survive in the wild yet. It needs constant care, specialized feeding, warmth. His eyes moved to Jacob, who was offering the cub his finger to grip. But it's already chosen its protector. The words should have been absurd. An 18-month-old child couldn't be responsible for a bear cub. Yet watching Jacob's careful movements, the way he seemed to anticipate the cub's needs before it even cried, made them all pause. This wasn't about logic or what made sense in the ordinary world. This was about something older, something that existed before humans decided they were separate from nature. Lily found herself thinking about all the stories she'd read to Jacob, the ones about children and animals, about magical connections that adults dismissed as fantasy. What if they weren't fantasy at all, but memories of something we'd lost? Mr. Morrison made his call, speaking quietly to someone named Michael Hayes, who apparently worked with the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center 2 towns over. From what they could hear of the conversation, Michael was Sarah's protégé, someone who understood both the scientific and, Mr. Morrison's tone suggested, the more mysterious aspects of human-wildlife interaction. He would come immediately, but the drive would take at least an hour. In the meantime, they had to keep the cub warm and calm, tasks that Jacob seemed to be accomplishing without any instruction. As they waited, Mr. Morrison told them more about Sarah and her work. She hadn't just been a ranger, she'd been what some of the older locals called a bridge keeper, someone who maintained the delicate treaties between the human and wild worlds. It sounded like folklore, the kind of stories that belonged in children's books, not in a shoe store on a Tuesday afternoon. Yet here they were, watching a baby and a bear cub communicate in a language that needed no words, proving that sometimes the folklore was more true than the facts. The bell above the door chimed, and they all turned, expecting Michael. Instead, a woman entered. Tall and graceful with silver hair braided down her back. She wore ordinary clothes, jeans, and a flannel shirt, but something about her presence made the air in the store shift. She looked directly at Jacob and the cub, and her face broke into a smile that was both sad and triumphant. "So it's happened," she said, her voice carrying an accent that might have been Cherokee or Creek. "Sarah said it would, but I wondered if I'd live to see it." Mr. Morrison seemed to recognize her, though surprise flickered across his face. "Savannah Reed," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I haven't seen you since Sarah's funeral." Savannah nodded, moving closer to Jacob with movements that reminded Lily of water, fluid and purposeful. She knelt beside the child, not reaching for the cub, but simply observing, her dark eyes taking in every detail. Jacob looked at her with the same serious expression he'd worn all afternoon, as if he was evaluating whether she could be trusted with this precious secret. "My grandmother knew Sarah's grandmother," Savannah said, settling into a cross-legged position on the floor with a grace that belied her age. They kept the old agreements, the ones made before the town was built, when this was all forest and the bears were the guardians of the mountain passes. She reached into her bag and pulled out a bundle wrapped in soft leather, unfolding it to reveal dried herbs and what looked like corn pollen. "May I?" she asked, looking not at the adults but at Jacob. The toddler considered for a moment, then shifted slightly, allowing Savannah closer to the cub. She didn't touch either of them but began to sprinkle the pollen in a circle around them, murmuring words in a language none of them recognized but which seemed to resonate in their bones. The cub, which had been restless, suddenly calmed, its breathing becoming deep and regular. Jacob's eyes drooped, but he didn't let go of his charge, his small body swaying slightly as if moved by an unfelt breeze. The mother knew exactly what she was doing, Savannah said when she finished. This store sits on what my people call a threshold place, where the agreements are strongest. She brought her cub here because she knew the old promise would be honored. She looked at Mr. Morrison with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of knowledge. Your Sarah understood this. That's why she chose you, why she made you the keeper of this place. The afternoon was fading into evening, the golden light deepening to amber. The store, which should have closed an hour ago, remained locked in this moment outside of normal time. Ethan found himself thinking about all the times he'd dismissed his grandmother's stories about animals that could speak and children who could understand them. Lily was remembering a photograph she'd taken once of Jacob in the garden with a butterfly landed on his nose, how the butterfly had stayed there for nearly a minute while Jacob remained perfectly still, as if they were having a conversation. When Michael Hayes finally arrived, he brought with him the practical necessities: special formula, heating pads, a small carrier designed for infant wildlife. But he also brought something else, an understanding that this situation required more than just wildlife rehabilitation protocols. He was younger than they'd expected, maybe 30, with kind eyes and hands that moved with the same careful grace they'd seen in Savannah. He examined the cub professionally but gently, checking its temperature, its reflexes, its overall health. She's in remarkably good condition, he said, and they all noted the pronoun, making the cub suddenly more real, more individual. Maybe 3 days old, like Mr. Morrison said. The mother must have been feeding her right up until... He paused, looking at the circle of pollen that still seemed to shimmer slightly on the floor. This is unprecedented, he said softly. A cub this young surviving alone, even for a few hours, then being found like this. His eyes moved to Jacob, who was watching him with that same evaluating stare. Michael opened his carrier, but before he could reach for the cub, Jacob made a sound of protest. Not loud, but firm. He pulled the cub closer, his small face set in determination. This was the first time all afternoon he'd shown any resistance, and it stopped everyone cold. Michael sat back on his heels, exchanging glances with Savannah, who nodded slightly as if confirming something they both understood. The rules were different here, in this threshold place with this particular child. What if, Michael said slowly, as if testing the words, we didn't follow standard protocol? What if we honored the older agreement? He looked at Ethan and Lily, including them in whatever was being decided. The cub needs round-the-clock care for at least 3 weeks. Normally, that would happen at the center, but there have been cases, rare ones, where the care happened in partnership with the finders. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. It would mean you'd all be trained, your home would be inspected, and there would be daily visits. It's not usually done, but this isn't a usual situation. Lily found herself speaking before she'd fully formed the thought. Jacob won't let her go. Look at him. And it was true. Her son, who usually had the attention span of a typical toddler, had been holding the cub for nearly 2 hours without complaint, without fidgeting, without any of his normal restlessness. He was different, transformed by this responsibility he couldn't possibly understand, but seemed to embody completely. And maybe he's not supposed to let her go. Maybe this is exactly what's supposed to happen. Ethan, ever practical, was running through the logistics in his mind. Their small house with its big backyard that backed up to the same forest preserve. Lily's flexible schedule as a freelance photographer. His own construction work that would slow down in the coming weeks. It was almost as if their lives had been arranged for this moment, this unexpected responsibility. He thought about saying no, about all the reasonable objections, but then he looked at his son's face, at the perfect trust between child and cub, and knew that reason had very little to do with what was happening here. "We'll do it," he said, and the words seemed to release something in the room, a tension none of them had fully noticed until it was gone. Savannah smiled, the first full smile they'd seen from her, transforming her face into something radiant. Mr. Morrison nodded as if this was exactly what he'd expected. Michael began explaining what would be needed, the feeding schedule, the temperature requirements, the signs to watch for, but they were all really watching Jacob, who had begun humming again, the same tuneless melody that seemed to speak directly to the cub's heart. As they prepared to leave, Mr. Morrison pulled something from beneath the counter, a small wooden tag on a leather cord. Carved into it was a symbol that matched one of the carvings on his wooden box, a circle with a bear paw in the center surrounded by stars. "This was Sarah's," he said, handing it not to Ethan or Lily but placing it carefully in Jacob's free hand. "She said to give it to the next keeper when they revealed themselves." Jacob looked at it seriously, then tried to put it in his mouth, which made everyone laugh, breaking the spell of solemnity that had held them all. The laughter was good, necessary even, reminding them that despite the mystery and weight of what was happening, Jacob was still a baby, the cub was still a wild animal, and they were still just people trying to do the right thing in a situation that had no manual, no precedent they could follow. As they bundled both babies, human and ursine, into the car, with Michael following in his van full of supplies, Savannah pressed something into Lily's hand. It was a phone number written on what looked like handmade paper. "For when you have questions that Google can't answer," she said with a wink, "and you will have them. This little one," she gestured to the cub, "is going to teach you all things you didn't know you needed to learn." She touched Jacob's head gently, a blessing or a recognition, then walked away into the evening, her figure seeming to fade into the shadows between the buildings as if she'd never been there at all. The drive home was surreal. Jacob sat in his car seat, the cub secured in a special carrier next to him, but he kept one hand on the carrier, maintaining contact. Every time they hit a bump or turned a corner, he would make soothing sounds, the same sounds Lily made when he was upset. He was mothering the cub with an instinct that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than learned behavior, from some genetic memory of when humans and animals were not so separate, when caring for each other was as natural as breathing. Their house, a modest 2-story with yellow siding and a wraparound porch, looked different somehow when they pulled into the driveway. It was still their home, but now it was also about to become something else. A sanctuary, a bridge between worlds, a place where the impossible would become routine. Michael pulled in behind them, already on his phone with his supervisor, explaining the situation in terms that were both clinical and somehow poetic. Yes, the cub was stable. Yes, the finders were suitable. Yes, this was irregular. No, he couldn't fully explain why this felt like the right decision. As they set up what Michael called a nursery station in the living room, complete with heating pads, bottles, formula, and monitoring equipment, the reality of what they'd committed to began to sink in. Every 2 hours round the clock, the cub would need to be fed. Her temperature would need to be monitored constantly. There were a dozen things that could go wrong, from aspiration during feeding to failure to thrive. Yet watching Jacob settle on the carpet beside the cub's temporary enclosure, his small hand resting on the mesh side, made all the logical concerns seem secondary. That first night was a revelation. They took shifts, Ethan and Lily, but Jacob woke every time the cub needed feeding, padding downstairs in his footy pajamas to supervise. He couldn't hold the bottle. His hands were too small and uncoordinated for that. But he held the cub while Lily or Ethan fed her. his presence seeming to calm the tiny creature in a way that nothing else did. By dawn, they were all exhausted but exhilarated, bound together by this shared purpose that none of them fully understood, but all of them felt. Michael arrived early the next morning with his supervisor, Dr. Jessica Brooks, a woman whose skepticism was evident in every line of her body. She examined the cub thoroughly, reviewed the feeding logs, checked the setup, all while maintaining a professional distance that suggested she was looking for reasons to end this experiment. But then she saw Jacob with the cub, saw the way the tiny bear responded to his presence, and something in her expression shifted. She sat back, pulling off her glasses to clean them, a gesture that seemed to buy her time to process what she was seeing. In 30 years of wildlife rehabilitation, she said slowly, I've never seen anything like this. This cub should be failing. Without her mother, at this age, even with our best care, the survival rate is less than 50%, but she's thriving. She looked at the charts Michael had prepared, the steady weight gain, the strong vital signs, the alert responses. What's your secret? She asked Jacob, who responded by offering her a slobbery goldfish cracker, which made her laugh despite herself. The days fell into a rhythm that was both exhausting and strangely peaceful. Feed the cub, feed Jacob, change diapers, both species, nap when possible, repeat. Lily documented everything with her camera, creating a visual diary that she knew was important, even if she couldn't say why. The photos showed the gradual changes, the cub's eyes becoming clearer, more focused, Jacob's movements becoming more deliberate, more purposeful, the way they seemed to grow into each other's rhythms until it was hard to tell where one's needs ended and the other's began. Neighbors began to notice the wildlife rehabilitation van in the driveway, and rumors spread as they do in small towns. But instead of problems, they found support. Mrs. Chen from next door brought casseroles. The teenage Parker twins offered to mow the lawn. Even cranky Mr. Peterson, who complained about everything, was seen leaving a box of supplies from the pet store on their porch with no note, though everyone knew it was him. The town seemed to understand that something important was happening, even if they couldn't name it. On the 10th day, the cub opened her eyes fully for the first time, and they were looking directly at Jacob. He laughed, that pure baby laugh that makes everything else in the world seem less important, and the cub made a sound in response that wasn't quite a growl or a purr, but something in between, a sound of recognition and contentment. Lily caught it on video, and later, when she watched it back, she noticed something she hadn't seen in the moment, a faint shimmer in the air between them, like heat waves but more deliberate, as if something invisible was being exchanged. Savannah visited on the 2-week mark, bringing with her an old woman who spoke no English but whose eyes held the kind of wisdom that transcends language. The woman sat with Jacob and the cub for an hour, singing in a language that sounded like wind through leaves, like water over stones. The cub, who was usually restless between feedings, fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, and Jacob curled up beside her enclosure, his hand through the mesh, touching her fur. When the women left, they spoke quietly to Lily in the kitchen, their words a mixture of practical advice and something more mystical. The bond is setting, Savannah explained, like concrete that's been poured and is beginning to harden. What happens in these next weeks will determine the shape of their connection for life. She must have seen the alarm on Lily's face because she quickly added, "Not that they'll be physically bound. The cub will return to the wild when she's ready, but they'll always know each other, always be connected. Your son is becoming what my grandmother would have called a bridge walker, someone who exists comfortably in both worlds." The idea should have been frightening. The thought of her baby son carrying such a responsibility. But watching him with the cub, seeing the joy and purpose in his movements, Lily felt only a deep sense of rightness. This was who Jacob was meant to be, maybe who he'd always been. All those times animals had been drawn to him. All those moments when he'd seemed to understand things beyond his years, they'd been preparing for this. She thought about the photograph Mr. Morrison had shown them of him and Sarah and the grown bear, and wondered what their story would look like in 40 years. On the third week, exactly 21 days after finding the cub, something shifted. The little bear was stronger now, more active, beginning to explore beyond the immediate comfort of her enclosure. She would follow Jacob around the house, the two of them a comical pair, the toddling human and the tumbling bear, both still unsteady on their feet but determined to investigate everything. Ethan had to baby-proof the house all over again, this time for a different species, but he did it with good humor, understanding that this chaos was temporary and precious. Michael's visits had become less clinical and more social. He would bring his lunch and eat with them, sharing stories of other unusual animal-human bonds he'd witnessed or heard about. There was the hawk that returned every year to visit the man who'd saved it from a trap. The deer that would bring her fawns to show to the woman who'd helped her through a difficult birth. The fox that left gifts of feathers and interesting stones on the porch of the child who'd shared his sandwich with it one winter day. These stories, which might have seemed fanciful before, now seemed simply true, part of a hidden world that existed alongside the visible one. One evening, as the sun set through the kitchen windows, casting everything in gold and amber light, they realized the cub had a name. Jacob had been calling her something that sounded like Aya all day, and the cub responded to it, turning her head when he said it, coming when he called. When they asked him where he'd heard that name, he just smiled and continued playing, but Savannah later told them it meant dawn in one of the old languages, a perfect name for a creature that had brought new light into their lives. The day came, as they knew it would, when Dr. Hasbrooks declared Aya strong enough to begin the transition process. She would need to start spending time outdoors, learning to forage, developing the skills she would need to survive in the wild. The backyard, with its access to the forest preserve, became a training ground. They would sit outside for hours, Jacob and Aya, exploring the grass and leaves, discovering bugs and berries, learning the world together. Sometimes other bears would appear at the forest edge, watching but not approaching, as if they too understood something special was happening. Mr. Morrison visited one afternoon, bringing with him the wooden box he'd shown them that first day. This time, he pulled out the map, the one drawn on hide, and spread it on the picnic table. It showed the town as it had been over a century ago, when it was just a few buildings at the crossroads of two trading paths, but it also showed something else, a network of lines connecting various points, each marked with symbols similar to the one on the wooden tag he'd given Jacob. These were the threshold places, he explained, the spots where the agreement between humans and nature was strongest. The shoe store is one, he said, pointing to a symbol that clearly marked that location. Your house is another. And indeed, there was a mark right where their property would be, though the house hadn't been built when the map was made. These places choose their keepers. Sarah always said the land remembers, even when we forget. He looked at Jacob, who was trying to feed Aya a dandelion, both of them ending up with yellow pollen on their noses. Your son will know things as he grows. The land will teach him, the animals will guide him. It's not a burden if it's accepted with joy. As summer turned toward autumn, Aya grew rapidly, her baby fuzz replaced by proper fur, her movements becoming more coordinated and purposeful. She could climb now, and forage, and even fish in the small stream that ran through the back of the preserve. But every evening she would return to the house, to Jacob, and they would sit together on the porch. the boy reading picture books aloud in his babbling toddler language while the bear listened with apparent interest. It was during one of these sessions that they noticed the other animals gathering: squirrels in the trees, rabbits in the bushes, even a doe at the forest edge. All watching the strange pair with what looked like approval. The local news got wind of the story, despite everyone's attempts to keep it quiet. A reporter showed up one day, eager for what she clearly thought would be a human interest piece about a family raising a bear cub. But when she saw Jacob and Aya together, saw the way they moved in sync, the way they seemed to communicate without sound, her angle changed. The story she ended up writing was less about the unusual pet situation and more about the connection between children and nature, about the things we lose as we grow up and forget how to see the world through innocent eyes. The story brought unexpected visitors. Other families with children who had similar gifts, they called them, though Jacob's connection with Aya seemed uniquely strong. There was a girl who could call birds, a boy who always knew when storms were coming, twins who could find water no matter how deep it was hidden. Their parents came seeking advice, but Ethan and Lily had none to give except to trust the children, to let them lead the way in their relationships with the natural world. They started meeting monthly, these families, creating a support group for something that had no name but didn't need one. Dr. Brooks became a regular at these gatherings, her scientific mind fascinated by what she was observing. She started documenting everything, not for publication but for posterity, understanding that they were witnessing something that might be important for future generations to understand. She brought in colleagues carefully, ones she trusted to observe without disrupting, and slowly a body of evidence began to build that suggested human-animal bonds went deeper than anyone had previously documented, that there were connections that science was only beginning to have the tools to measure. One night, when Aya was about 4 months old and beginning to look more like a proper bear cub than a baby, something extraordinary happened. Jacob had been fussy all day, coming down with a cold, and Lily had finally gotten him to sleep in his crib. But an hour later, they heard movement and found Aya had somehow gotten into the house and climbed the stairs to Jacob's room. She was curled up on the floor beside his crib, and Jacob's hand was hanging through the bars, resting on her head. His fever had broken, and he was sleeping peacefully. They left them there, understanding that the healing went both ways. The Forest Service got involved as Aya grew larger, not to interfere but to learn. They set up cameras along the preserve boundaries, documenting her movements, her interactions with wild bears, her unusual behavior of returning to human habitation. What they found challenged everything they thought they knew about bear behavior and development. Aya was learning faster than any cub they'd studied, picking up survival skills not just from instinct, but from what seemed to be deliberate teaching by the wild bears that visited the forest edge. It was as if they understood she was special, needed extra help to make up for her unusual upbringing. Michael brought news one day that changed everything. A female bear had been spotted in the area, one with distinctive markings that suggested she might be related to Aya's mother. DNA testing would confirm it, but the behavior was even more telling. She would come to the edge of the yard when Aya was out, watching but not approaching, making soft sounds that Aya responded to with increasing interest. An aunt, perhaps, or an older sister, someone who remembered the agreement and had come to help honor it. The meeting, when it finally happened, was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Aya was 6 months old, nearly ready to be independent, when the female bear finally approached. Jacob was there, of course, sitting on the grass with his ever-present picture books. The adult bear moved slowly, carefully, her eyes moving between Aya and Jacob as if asking permission. Jacob, in his serious toddler way, nodded and gently pushed Aya forward. The two bears touched noses, and something passed between them that made Aya's whole body relax in a way they'd never seen before. For the next month, the adult bear, whom Jacob named Luna, would visit daily. She taught Aya things that humans couldn't: how to mark territory, how to find the best berries, how to prepare for winter, but she never tried to take Aya away, seeming to understand that the cub's education needed both wild and human elements. Sometimes Luna would sit near Jacob, not touching but present, and he would read to her from his books, the same way he did with Aya. It was clear that the trust extended beyond just Aya. Jacob had somehow become part of the bear community's understanding of the world. The decision for Aya to leave came not from the humans but from Aya herself. One morning, in late autumn, she didn't come back to the house after her dawn exploration. They found her at the forest edge with Luna, and when Jacob called to her, she came but only part way. She sat between the wild and the human world, looking back and forth, and everyone understood. She was choosing, and the choice was to follow Luna into the deeper forest. Jacob walked to her, hugged her one last time, whispered something in her ear that made her huff softly, then walked back to his parents without looking back. They thought that would be the end, a bittersweet but necessary conclusion to an extraordinary chapter. Aya would be wild, Jacob would grow up, and eventually it would all become a story they told, evidence of a magical time that couldn't last. But the bears had other plans. Aya visited regularly, always careful, always respectful of the boundaries between wild and domestic. As she grew into a magnificent adult bear, she would bring things to show Jacob. Interesting rocks, perfect pine cones, once a honeycomb that she left on the porch like a gift. And when Aya had cubs of her own, 3 years later, she brought them to the edge of the yard one spring morning. Jacob was 4 by then, old enough to understand the honor of what was happening. Aya introduced her cubs to him with the same careful ceremony that Luna had used with her, and the cycle continued. The cubs would visit but remain wild, would know Jacob but not depend on him, maintaining the delicate balance that had been established through trust and respect. Chapter 2. The Guardian's Mark. The morning after Aya brought her cubs to visit, something unusual appeared on the porch. It was a wooden tag, similar to the one Mr. Morrison had given Jacob, but clearly older, weathered by years in the forest. Carved into it was not just a bear paw, but a whole scene. A human child and a bear cub beneath a tree that seemed to be made of stars. Lily found it when she went to get the morning paper, and the wood was still damp with dew, as if it had been placed there in the pre-dawn hours. When she showed it to Jacob, his face lit up with recognition, though he couldn't possibly have seen it before. "Story tag," he said simply, turning it over in his small hands. On the back were symbols that looked like the ones on Mr. Morrison's map, but arranged differently, almost like a message or a set of directions. Ethan photographed it carefully before letting Jacob keep it, understanding that this was another piece of a puzzle they were only beginning to see. The tag smelled of pine and something else, something wild and ancient that made them all think of deep forests and hidden paths. That afternoon, Savannah arrived without being called, as she sometimes did when something significant was happening. She examined the tag with reverence, running her fingers over the carved symbols, her lips moving as if reading something written in a language only she understood. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with meaning. "This is a guardian's mark," she said. "They're given to those who have proven themselves as protectors of the old agreements. In all my years, I've only seen 3 others." She told them about the marks, how they appeared throughout history at moments when the balance between human and wild needed reinforcement. There was one given to a woman in the 1800s who had protected a wolf den from hunters, another to a man who had guided migrating birds away from a new factory that would have destroyed them. Each mark came with a responsibility, she explained, but also with a gift, the ability to understand, to truly understand what the natural world was trying to communicate. As if to prove her point, Jacob suddenly stood and walked to the window, pressing his small hand against the glass. Outside, a cardinal sat on the fence post, its head cocked as if listening, and Jacob made a soft chirping sound, and the bird responded, flying to the window and hovering there for a moment before returning to its post. They went back and forth like this several times, clearly exchanging something, though what exactly remained a mystery to the watching adults. When the bird finally flew away, Jacob turned back to them with a satisfied expression. "Bird says storm coming. Big storm, tonight." The weather forecast had been clear for the week, but Ethan checked his phone anyway. Sure enough, an unexpected system had developed and was moving their way, bringing what meteorologists were calling an unusual autumn storm. It would arrive, they said, around midnight. Jacob had known hours before the sophisticated weather tracking systems had detected it. Lily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. What else would Jacob know as he grew? What other responsibilities would come with this gift? They prepared for the storm, securing outdoor furniture, checking flashlights, filling containers with water just in case. As darkness fell, the wind began to pick up, rattling the windows with increasing intensity. Jacob seemed unconcerned, playing with his blocks in the living room. But every now and then he would look toward the forest and nod, as if receiving updates from unseen informants. Around 10 o'clock, he stood up decisively and walked to the back door, pointing insistently at the handle. "Bears," he said simply. "Need help." Ethan started to explain that bears would be fine in a storm, that they had sheltered in storms for thousands of years without human help. But something in Jacob's expression stopped him. This wasn't a general concern. This was specific, urgent. Against their better judgment, they bundled up in rain gear and followed Jacob into the backyard. The wind was howling now, bending trees and sending leaves swirling in chaotic patterns. Jacob walked purposefully toward the forest edge, his small body leaning into the wind. There, in a hollow between two large rocks that Ethan had never noticed before, was Luna. But something was wrong. She was lying on her side, breathing heavily, and there was blood on the leaves around her. Not from an injury they could see, but from birthing. She was in labor, here in the storm, and from her distressed sounds, something wasn't going right. Jacob approached without fear, placing his tiny hand on her massive head, and she calmed slightly, her wild eyes focusing on him with what looked impossibly like trust. Lily ran back to the house to call Michael, shouting into the phone over the wind. He said he'd come immediately, but warned them not to intervene. That a bear in distress could be dangerous even if she knew them. But Jacob was already intervening in his own way, humming that tuneless melody that had calmed Aya as a cub, his hand never leaving Luna's head. The bear's breathing steadied slightly, though she still strained with each contraction. Ethan felt helpless, watching his small son comfort a creature that could kill him with one swipe of her paw. The storm reached its peak just as Michael arrived, bringing with him Dr. Keir Sodenbrooks and an emergency veterinary kit. They approached slowly, amazed that Luna was allowing human presence during such a vulnerable time. The examination was quick but thorough, and Dr. Brooks' face was grim. "The cub is positioned wrong," she said. "In the wild, this would likely mean death for both mother and cub." She looked at the equipment she'd brought, then at Luna, clearly weighing impossible options. What happened next would be debated and discussed for years afterward. Dr. Brooks said she was preparing to sedate Luna to attempt to reposition the cub, a dangerous procedure even in a veterinary hospital. But before she could prepare the injection, Jacob placed both hands on Luna's swollen belly and began to sing. Not the humming from before, but actual words, though in no language any of them recognized. The words seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory, older than learning. Luna's whole body relaxed, and beneath Jacob's hands, impossibly, the cub shifted. Dr. Brooks watched her equipment, monitoring vital signs that showed something that shouldn't be happening. The cub was moving on its own, turning into the correct position without any external manipulation. Within minutes, Luna gave a great push, and a tiny cub emerged into the storm-torn world. But she wasn't done. Another cub followed, then a third. Triplets were rare in bears, almost unheard of, and in a storm, with a difficult birth, their survival chances were minimal. But Jacob was already moving, guided by instinct or knowledge that came from somewhere beyond his 3 years of life. He gathered the cubs against Luna's belly, making sure each found a nipple, their tiny mouths working to get the crucial first milk. The storm still raged around them, but in this small hollow, there was a bubble of calm, as if the wind and rain couldn't quite reach them. Michael had strung up an emergency tarp, creating additional shelter, while Dr. C.R. Brooks monitored the cubs' temperatures with practiced efficiency. All three were small but healthy, their little bodies already showing the instinct to nurse and nestle against their mother's warmth. Luna looked at Jacob with eyes that held something beyond animal instinct, something that spoke of understanding and gratitude that transcended species. She made a soft sound, and Jacob nodded as if accepting thanks, then curled up against her side, his small body adding its warmth to the pile of bears. Lily started to pull him away, terrified of what Luna might do now that the crisis had passed, but the bear just curved her body around him, including him in the protective circle she'd created for her cubs. They stayed there through the night, all of them, humans and bears, together in the small shelter while the storm exhausted itself above them. Michael and Dr. Brooks took turns monitoring the cubs, making sure they were nursing properly, checking their temperatures. Ethan and Lily watched their son sleep peacefully against the side of a wild bear, protected and protecting in equal measure. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling with droplets that caught the early sun like diamonds. Luna rose carefully, mindful of the humans around her, and began to move her cubs one by one to a den deeper in the forest. But before taking the last cub, she did something extraordinary. She approached Jacob, who had woken and was watching her work, and very gently touched her nose to the wooden tag he wore around his neck. Then she picked up her last cub and disappeared into the forest, leaving them all standing in the morning light, trying to process what they had witnessed. Dr. Brooks was the first to speak, her scientific mind struggling with what couldn't be explained by any theory she knew. "That shouldn't have happened," she said simply. "Any of it. The cub repositioning itself, Luna accepting our help, the survival of triplets in those conditions. It's all impossible." She looked at Jacob, who was now playing with a stick, drawing patterns in the mud that looked suspiciously like the symbols on his wooden tag. "Unless we're dealing with something that operates outside our understanding of possible." The story of the storm birth spread through the community like wildfire, growing and changing with each telling. Some said Jacob had magical powers, others that the bears were enchanted, still others that it was all coincidence and exaggeration. But those who had been there knew the truth was both simpler and more complex than any of the stories. It wasn't magic in the fairy tale sense. It was something older, more fundamental, a connection that existed before humans decided they were separate from nature. In the days that followed, other animals began to appear at the forest edge. Not just the usual squirrels and birds, but deer, foxes, even a bobcat once, sitting at a respectful distance but clearly observing the house where the boy with the guardian's mark lived. They never approached, never threatened, just watched as if keeping vigil. Mrs. Chen next door started leaving bowls of water out for them, and the Parker twins built little shelters that the animals seemed to appreciate. The whole neighborhood began to feel like a sanctuary, a place where the usual rules were gently suspended. Mr. Morrison visited a week after the storm, bringing with him someone they hadn't expected, a very old man, Native American by appearance, wearing modern clothes but carrying himself with an authority that seemed to come from another time. He introduced himself simply as Connor Adams, though Mr. Morrison's deference suggested he was much more than his simple introduction implied. Connor sat with Jacob for a long time, not speaking, just observing as the boy played with his toys and occasionally looked out the window at the gathering animals. Finally, Connor spoke, his voice carrying the weight of years and wisdom. The mark he carries is older than this town, older than the maps that show this place. It goes back to the first agreement when humans and animals decided to share the world rather than fight over it. He pulled out a leather pouch, similar to the one Mr. Morrison had shown them, but older. The leather soft with age. Inside were more wooden tags, each with different symbols, each representing a different guardian throughout history. "Your son," he continued, looking at Ethan and Lily with eyes that seemed to see through time, "is not the first and won't be the last. But he may be the most important. The world is forgetting the agreements. Cities spread, forests shrink, and the connections that keep us all alive are breaking." He gestured to the window, where a red-tailed hawk had just landed on the fence, joining the informal gathering of creatures. They know this. They're gathering because they recognize him as someone who can help maintain the balance. The weight of this responsibility should have been crushing. The idea that their 3-year-old son was somehow crucial to maintaining harmony between human and natural worlds. But watching Jacob, seeing the joy he took in every interaction with the animals, the natural ease with which he moved between the two worlds, made it seem less like a burden and more like a gift. He wasn't being asked to do something against his nature. He was being recognized for who he already was. Connor stayed for 3 days, teaching Jacob things that seemed impossible for a toddler to understand, yet which the boy absorbed with startling ease. How to read the subtle signs that animals left. Not just tracks, but the way grass bent. The way air moved differently after they passed. How to make the soft sounds that meant peace in the universal language that predated human speech. How to know when an animal was sick or scared or angry, and what to do in each case. Jacob learned it all with the same focus he brought to his picture books, as if this knowledge was just another kind of story to understand. On Connor's last day, he performed a ceremony that he said had been passed down through generations of his family, who had been keepers of the agreements long before European settlers arrived. He burned sage and cedar, creating smoke that seemed to move with purpose rather than just drift on the wind. He spoke words in his ancestral language, and though none of them understood the words, they felt their meaning. A recognition, a blessing, a passing of responsibility from one generation to the next. When it was over, the wooden tag Jacob wore seemed different somehow, warmer to the touch, as if it had been activated or awakened. That night, Jacob had a dream, though he was too young to fully articulate it. He drew pictures the next morning, crude toddler drawings, but clear enough. Bears and humans standing together. A great tree whose roots and branches connected everything. And at the center a child holding hands with creatures of all kinds. Lily saved these drawings, understanding that they were important even if she couldn't say why. They seemed less like a child's imagination and more like a memory of something that hadn't happened yet, or perhaps had happened long ago. The cubs Luna had birthed in the storm grew rapidly, visiting the yard often with their mother. Jacob named them, as he had named their mother and aunt, Storm, River, and Sky. Each had distinct personalities that became apparent as they grew. Storm was bold, always the first to investigate something new. River was cautious but clever, finding ways around obstacles rather than through them. Sky was gentle, often sitting quietly near Jacob while he played, seeming to enjoy just being in his presence. As autumn turned to winter, the bears prepared for hibernation, but not before one last gathering. It happened on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. All the bears that had been part of their extended family over the past year came to the yard. Aya with her cubs, Luna with hers, and several others they hadn't seen before but who seemed to know Jacob. They arranged themselves in a circle in the snow-covered yard, and Jacob, bundled in his winter coat and boots, stood in the center. What happened next was witnessed by half the neighborhood, drawn by some instinct to their windows at that exact moment. The bears began to move in a slow circle around Jacob, not threatening, but ceremonial. Their breath creating clouds in the cold air that seemed to form patterns before dissipating. Jacob raised his small arms, and from the forest came other animals. Deer, foxes, rabbits, even a few wolves that should have sent the smaller creatures fleeing, but didn't. They all joined the circle, creating rings within rings, all moving in the same slow, purposeful rhythm. It lasted maybe 10 minutes, this strange dance in the snow, but those who saw it said it felt like hours, like time had stretched to accommodate something that needed to happen. When it ended, the animals dispersed as quietly as they had come, leaving only tracks in the snow that formed a pattern that looked, from the bedroom windows above, like a massive version of the symbol on Jacob's wooden tag. By morning, fresh snow had covered the tracks, but everyone who had seen it carried the image in their minds, a reminder that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Dr. Brooks, ever the scientist, had managed to photograph the track pattern before it was covered. When she analyzed it later, she found mathematical relationships that shouldn't exist in random animal movements. Golden ratios, Fibonacci sequences, geometric patterns that spoke of an intelligence or instinct that transcended individual species. She wrote a paper about it, carefully avoiding any mystical interpretations, focusing only on the observable phenomena. But privately, she had begun to believe that science and mystery were not opposites, but different ways of approaching the same truths. Winter passed quietly, the bears sleeping in their dens, Jacob growing and learning with the rapid pace of early childhood. He started preschool, where his teachers noticed his unusual ability to calm upset children and his tendency to know when someone was sick before they showed symptoms. Animals were drawn to the playground when he was there. Birds would land on the fence to watch him play, squirrels would come unusually close, and once memorably, a deer walked right up to the playground fence and stood there while Jacob petted its nose through the chain link. Spring brought the bears back, and with them a new challenge. Development was coming to the forest preserve, not the whole preserve, but a section that included several important den sites and the stream where the bears fished. The town council was divided, some seeing the economic benefits, others worried about the environmental impact. The public hearings were contentious, with passionate arguments on both sides. It seemed like the kind of conflict that had no good solution, where someone would have to lose for someone else to win. But Jacob, now 4 and more articulate, had an idea. He wanted to speak at the town council meeting. Ethan and Lily were hesitant, knowing how these meetings could get, but something in Jacob's determination convinced them. So, on a Tuesday evening in April, Jacob stood on a box behind the podium, the microphone adjusted down to his level, and spoke to a packed room that had come expecting conflict, but found something else entirely. He didn't talk about development or economics or environmental impact. He talked about his friends, the bears, describing each one's personality, their families, their daily routines. He talked about the agreement, using simple words that somehow carried profound meaning. He talked about how the bears had taught him things that helped him help other people, like when he knew Tommy at school was sad about his parents' divorce before Tommy told anyone, or when he helped find Mrs. Patterson's cat by thinking like an animal instead of a human. Then he did something unexpected. He invited everyone to come see for themselves. Not the bears necessarily, but the preserve, to really see it. Not just as land, but as home to creatures that were their neighbors just as much as the human residents were. The mayor, perhaps moved by the innocence of the request, or perhaps sensing an opportunity to diffuse the situation, agreed to organize a community walk through the preserve that weekend, with Jacob as the guide. That Saturday, over 100 people showed up, far more than anyone expected. Jacob led them along paths most didn't know existed, pointing out things they'd never noticed: the owl nest in the hollow tree, the beaver dam that prevented flooding downstream, the medicinal plants that Native Americans had used for centuries, and that still grew wild here. He showed them tracks and signs, teaching them to see the forest not as empty space, but as a busy community with its own economy and social structure. Halfway through the walk, Aya appeared at a distance, watching but not approaching. Then Luna with her yearling cubs. Then more bears and deer, and even the elusive bobcat, all maintaining safe distances but clearly visible, as if they understood what was at stake and had come to be counted. The developer, who had come perhaps to scope out the land, stood transfixed as a great blue heron landed nearby, and seemed to look directly at him. Later, he would say that was the moment he understood that profit wasn't the only way to measure value. The walk ended at a clearing where an ancient oak stood, its trunk so wide that 6 people holding hands couldn't encircle it. Connor Adams was there, having arrived without anyone seeing him come, and he told the story of the tree, how it had been a meeting place for centuries, where agreements were made between tribes, between humans and animals, between the past and the future. He pulled out a leather bundle and carefully unwrapped it, revealing documents that predated the town's incorporation, that showed this land had been set aside for a purpose that transcended ownership. The legal status of these documents was questionable, but their moral authority was undeniable. The developer withdrew his proposal that week, announcing instead a partnership with the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center to create an educational facility at the forest edge, one that would bring economic benefit while protecting the preserve. It wasn't a perfect solution, nothing ever was, but it was a balance, an agreement that honored all parties' needs. The town council voted unanimously to support it, and Jacob's role in achieving this compromise became part of local legend. But the real magic happened in the smaller moments that followed. Children who had attended the walk started spending more time outdoors, less time on screens. Adults began noticing birds they'd never seen before, even though the birds had always been there. Gardens grew wilder, more welcoming to butterflies and bees. The town slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to remember its connection to the land it was built on. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but a gentle awakening, like the forest itself waking from winter sleep. One evening in late spring, as the sun set through the trees and painted everything gold, Lily found Jacob sitting on the porch with the wooden tag in his hands, tracing the carved symbols with one small finger. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, settling beside him. He was quiet for a moment, then said something that seemed too profound for a 4-year-old. "The bears remember everything. They remember when the world was different. They're trying to teach us to remember too." She asked him what he meant, but he just smiled and went back to playing. The moment of unusual clarity passing as quickly as it had come. But later, when she developed the photographs she'd taken that day, she noticed something in the background of one. A bear she didn't recognize, older and larger than any they'd seen, standing at the very edge of the forest, almost invisible in the shadows. When she showed it to Connor, he studied it for a long time before speaking. "That's the grandfather," he said simply, "the one who remembers the first agreement. If he's showing himself, it means the circle is closing and opening at the same time." He wouldn't explain further, but that night, Jacob drew another picture, the same great tree from before, but now its roots and branches extended beyond the paper, as if the tree was too big for any single page to contain. At its base, he drew himself, but older, surrounded by children and animals, all learning together. Summer brought new cubs and new challenges. The educational facility was being built, and Jacob was asked to help design the children's area. His ideas were simple but revolutionary. Places where children and animals could safely observe each other, gardens that attracted wildlife, quiet spaces for sitting and listening. He insisted on windows at child height and bear height, viewing areas that worked for both species. The architects, initially skeptical, found that his suggestions solved problems they hadn't even recognized. The grand opening was scheduled for autumn. But nature had its own timeline. Luna's cubs, now full-grown, had cubs of their own, and one morning in August they brought them to the yard, 6 tiny cubs in total, the next generation of the agreement. Jacob, now more confident in his role, organized what he called Cub School, teaching neighborhood children how to observe without disturbing, how to respect boundaries while maintaining connection. The children learned to recognize individual bears, to understand their body language, to appreciate them as individuals rather than generic wildlife. It was during one of these sessions that something extraordinary happened. One of the cubs, the smallest of Storm's twins, approached closer than any bear had before except in emergency. She walked right up to the fence where the children sat, sniffed carefully, then did something unprecedented. She played. She batted at a ball that had rolled near the fence, pushing it back toward the children, initiating a gentle game that lasted several minutes while Storm watched, alert but not alarmed. When it ended, the cub returned to her mother, but the connection had been made. Dr. Brooks, who had been documenting everything, called it a breakthrough in interspecies communication. The bears were teaching their young that some humans could be trusted, that the agreement extended to the next generation, but Jacob saw it differently. "They're not learning to trust us," he said. "They're teaching us to be trustworthy." The distinction seemed subtle, but was profound, shifting the responsibility from the animals to the humans, making trust something that had to be earned and maintained rather than expected. The educational facility opened on the autumn equinox, with a ceremony that blended scientific presentation, traditional blessing, and children's celebration. Jacob cut the ribbon with safety scissors, surrounded by local officials, scientists, and a surprising number of animals that had gathered at the forest edge to observe. The facility was an immediate success, drawing visitors from neighboring states who had heard about the boy who could talk to bears and the town where wild and human coexisted. But fame brought challenges. Reporters wanted to interview Jacob. Scientists wanted to study him, and not all attention was benign. There were those who saw his gift as something to be exploited, who thought the bears could be monetized, who missed the point entirely. Ethan and Lily had to become fierce protectors of their son's childhood, limiting access, screening requests, maintaining the delicate balance between sharing the miracle and protecting its source. One incident stood out. A television crew had come to film a documentary, promising to be respectful and non-intrusive. But when they arrived, they brought equipment that hummed with electricity, bright lights that hurt the eyes, and an agenda that prioritized drama over truth. The bears, who had been visible all morning, disappeared. The birds fell silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. Jacob looked at the cameras and very clearly said, "They don't like lying machines." The crew, offended, demanded to know what he meant. But before anyone could answer, every piece of their electronic equipment simultaneously failed. Not dramatically, not dangerously, just stopped working. They left, muttering about power surges and magnetic fields, but those who were there knew better. Connor visited again that winter, bringing with him a gift. A small leather journal, its pages blank but somehow expectant. "For the stories," he said to Jacob, "the ones that need to be remembered." Jacob couldn't write yet, not really, but he began drawing in the journal, creating a visual record of his experiences that was part diary, part field guide, part prophecy. Each drawing was dated in his careful, childish hand, creating a chronology of the agreement's evolution. The winter was milder than usual, and the bear's hibernation was interrupted several times by warm spells. During one of these, Aya came to the yard with something in her mouth. A small wooden carving, crude but recognizable as a bear. She left it on the porch and returned to the forest, but the message was clear. Somewhere, someone else was making guardian's marks, preparing for the next generation of bridgewalkers. The network was growing, spreading beyond their small town to places they might never see but were now connected to. Spring came early, and with it, a crisis. One of the new cubs, Sky's daughter, had gotten caught in an illegal trap set by poachers in a remote part of the preserve. By the time she was found, infection had set in, and her leg was badly damaged. Dr. Brooks said the only way to save her life was amputation, but that would mean she could never return to the wild. The decision tormented everyone, especially Jacob, who understood that a bear who couldn't be wild wasn't really a bear anymore. But Sky herself seemed to make the decision. She brought her cub to the yard, to the exact spot where Luna had given birth in the storm, and waited. When Dr. Brooks arrived with her equipment, Sky didn't retreat. She stayed with her cub through the surgery, performed right there in the open, with Jacob holding the cub's paw and humming the old melody that had comforted so many. The surgery was successful, but now they had a 3-legged bear cub that would need care for life. The solution came from an unexpected source. The educational facility had been planning to create a residence for unreleasable wildlife, a place where injured animals could live while serving as ambassadors for their species. The cub, whom Jacob named Hope, became the first resident. But this wasn't a zoo or a display. Hope's enclosure connected to the wild preserve through a system of gates that could be opened when it was safe, allowing her to maintain connection with her family while having the support she needed. Hope thrived in her unique position, becoming a bridge herself between wild and captive, teaching thousands of children that disability didn't mean inability, that adaptation was a kind of strength. Sky visited daily, and gradually, Hope learned to move with surprising grace on 3 legs, even climbing trees and swimming. She became a symbol of resilience, and her story spread far beyond their town, inspiring wildlife rehabilitation centers worldwide to reconsider what unreleasable really meant. As Jacob grew older, his gift evolved. He could now sense disturbances in the forest from miles away, knowing when a tree had fallen or water was polluted before any official report. He began working with environmental scientists, his intuitive knowledge complementing their data in ways that revolutionized local conservation efforts. But he remained, at heart, a child who loved stories and animals, who found joy in simple connections, who never forgot that the agreement was about relationship, not dominion. One summer evening, as fireflies began their ancient dance and the bears gathered for their evening fishing, Jacob sat on the porch with his parents. He had the guardian's mark warm against his chest. "Do you ever wish," Lily asked carefully, "that you were just a regular kid?" Jacob thought for a moment, watching Storm's cubs play in the fading light, then shook his head. "Regular kids don't get to know the secret," he said. When Ethan asked what secret, Jacob smiled. That everything's connected, that every story is part of the same big story. That we're all just trying to find our way home. The truth of this statement settled over them like evening settling over the forest, gentle and encompassing. They sat in comfortable silence, 3 humans on a porch, surrounded by the quiet presence of creatures seen and unseen, all part of an agreement that stretched backward and forward through time, connecting every heartbeat to every other heartbeat in an endless rhythm of belonging. The bears finished fishing and melted back into the forest. The fireflies continued their dance, and somewhere a child was being born who would one day wear a guardian's mark, continuing a story that had no beginning and would have no end. As the seasons turned and years passed, the town became known as a place where miracles were ordinary, where children grew up bilingual in human and animal languages, where the impossible became possible through simple acts of trust and respect. Scientists came to study it, journalists came to document it, but none of them could quite capture the essence of what was happening. It wasn't something that could be measured or proved or replicated. It was something that had to be lived, breathed, felt in the bones. Jacob grew into his gift with grace, never seeing it as a burden, but as a conversation he was privileged to be part of. He learned that justice the title of his story promised, wasn't about laws or punishment, but about balance, about ensuring every voice was heard, even the voices that spoke in growls and chirps and the rustle of leaves. He learned that stepping up meant sometimes stepping back, making space for others to find their own connections. He learned that the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward in ways that changed everything. The bears continued to thrive, their population growing but stable. Their presence a constant reminder that wildness and civilization could coexist. Each new generation of cubs learned about the boy who had saved their grandmother, the family that had honored the agreement, the town that had chosen connection over conquest. And each new generation of human children learned that they were part of something larger than themselves, that their actions mattered in ways they might never fully understand, that every choice they made either strengthened or weakened the threads that held everything together. On Jacob's 10th birthday, something remarkable happened. Every animal that had been part of his journey appeared at the forest edge. Aya, with her 3rd set of cubs, Luna's descendants, Hope on her 3 legs, and dozens of others. They didn't approach, just stood there in silent acknowledgement, a living testament to a decade of trust. The whole town seemed to pause, people stopping whatever they were doing to witness this gathering. Then, as if by signal, they all turned and returned to the forest, leaving only tracks in the grass that spelled out, impossibly but undeniably, a single word: continue. And so the story continued, would always continue, because it wasn't really a story at all, but life itself, unfolding in all its mystery and wonder. The guardian's mark passed to other children in other places. The agreement spread like seeds on the wind. And slowly, quietly, the world began to remember what it had almost forgotten, that we are all related, all responsible, all part of the same endless, beautiful, terrifying, perfect story of being alive together on this small blue planet. The justice Jacob had stepped up for wasn't the dramatic kind that made headlines, but the quiet kind that changed hearts. It was the justice of recognition, of seeing every being as worthy of respect and protection. It was the justice of connection, of understanding that harming others ultimately meant harming oneself. It was the justice of love, fierce and tender and absolutely unconditional. The kind of love that could make a toddler brave enough to comfort a wild bear and wise enough to know that some gifts are too precious to keep for oneself.